you got the world's greatest power, and you team up with thugs, make a fortune on weapons, destruction and drugs, but your flags and boots and uniforms, they start to all smell the same when all sides are killing in the Patriot game. And that's how it's done. And you've got our sons in the crosshairs of horror at the end of your guns. And your national anthems, they start to all smell like shame when all sides are dying in the Patriot game. It's just a war racket. That's just a war racket. It's just a war racket. It's just a war racket. And war is never, ever holy. It's just a greedy man's dream.
Welcome to Heroes and Patriots, a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. Today is Thursday, July 2nd, 2020, and we are streaming live to you from the studios of KMUD Community Radio in Northern California. I'm Mary Massey with co-host John Sakowicz. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Mary, and good morning to our audiences, national and international, on this July 4th weekend.
Today's show and all programs will be archived here at KMUD and on our program website, heroespatriots.org. So I hope you will check back and see who our guests have been in the past and hear past programs. We are taking listener calls and emails to speak with our guests. To speak with our guests, call 707-923-3911, 923-3911, or you may email your questions if you prefer to heroesandpatriots@gmail.com. Our thanks today to Jennifer Porter Gore, who helped in producing the program today, and our engineer, Dorothy Sakowicz, for assisting with the production of today's program. Views and opinions expressed during this program do not necessarily reflect those of the board, staff, or volunteers. John, would you like to introduce our first guest?
Sure. I also want to thank our intern, Elliot Hershkowitz-Hale, home from Johns Hopkins. Hopefully he'll go on to a career in foreign service and complete his studies at the School of Advanced International Studies. I would like to introduce my friend, Matt Ho. There are so many talking heads and pundits who talk of war, who wouldn't know which end of a rifle to point. John Bolton being one of them. Matt Ho is not that guy. He's got tons of credibility because he has served. And those are the people I want to listen to. Matt has been a frequent guest on our show. He's had nearly 12 years experience with America's wars overseas, starting with the United States Marine Corps, Department of Defense, and the State Department. He's been a senior fellow with the Center for International Policy since 2010. In 2009, Matt resigned in protest from his post in Afghanistan with the State Department over the American escalation of the war. Prior to his assignment in Afghanistan, Matt Ho took part in the American occupation of Iraq, first in 2004-2005 in the Salah ad-Din province with the State Department Reconstruction and Governance Team, and then in 2006-2007 in Anbar province as a Marine Corps company commander. When not deployed, Matthew Ho worked on Afghanistan and Iraq war policy and operations issues at the Pentagon and at the State Department. Matt's writings have appeared online and in print in such periodicals as the Atlantic Journal-Constitution, Defense News, The Guardian, Huffington Post, USA Today, and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. Matt, you, my brother, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me back on. It's a pleasure to be here.
This is not your first time, and we're glad to have you return to the program. And in the past, we've talked about specifically about the Iraq War. And today we want to talk more about Afghanistan, the protracted 17-year war, and also the recent news about the bounty plot that has been in mainstream news a lot in the last few days, in particular the New York Times. You had mentioned that this is not the first time Russia has been accused of trying to harm U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan, such as in 2017-18. Let's start there. What was happening back then before we lead up in today's news?
Well, Back in 2017, there were accusations that the Russians were supplying weapons to the Taliban. The only confirmation of weapons going from Russia to Afghanistan was actually in 2016 when the Russian government provided the Afghanistan government with 10,000 rifles. The accusations about Russia providing weapons to the Taliban were no evidence was ever shown. And when senior U.S., NATO, and Afghan officials were asked about that, including during congressional testimony by the American Secretary of Defense and the American Chairman and Joint Chiefs of Staff, the statements made were that there was no evidence behind this, or that evidence had not been found, that these were just rumors. The problem being is that these rumors were given the weight of fact. And we see these rumors being circulated again. And now we have these news stories about the Russians supposedly paying for bounties for American soldiers in Afghanistan. Again, based on statements from anonymous officials and without evidence being shown, let alone someone coming forward with a name or a face to certify that, hey, I'm the one who leaked this, and this is what we actually know. So there's a great deal of uncertainty, and just like anything else, the reasons for this have more to do with American politics than with anything occurring in Afghanistan. Certainly, both parties in Washington, D.C. stand to gain from these unproven allegations just as much as they stand to gain, just as much as, say, the defense industry and the Pentagon stands to gain from increased tensions with Russia.
Can an argument be made, though, that given Trump's support, I don't know if you want to go so far as to say support of Putin, but his seemingly backing off of any criticism of Putin, can his intelligence officials argue that he's not going to be open to this kind of information, if you will?
I'm sure you can make that claim, although the reality is that the United States under Donald Trump has imposed pretty heavy sanctions on Russia, and the relationship between the United States and Russia has deteriorated to the point that the doomsday clock, which famously has been around for since all through the Cold War, is at the worst point it's ever been, 100 seconds to midnight. And if people aren't familiar with the doomsday clock, just Google it, and you'll find about how this is something done by the atomic scientists and has been done all through the Cold War and maintained to convey where tensions are and how close to nuclear annihilation we as a species are. And as I just said, the doomsday clock is at the closest level it's ever been, 100 seconds to midnight. So Donald Trump has actually been pretty aggressive with Russia. I would think that the argument about him not, if these are true and if he was briefed about it, I think that's probably got more to do with his lack of attention span or his disinterest in matters such as this, as opposed to him wanting to ignore it because he is friends with the Russian president.
Mm-hmm.
Matt, I was wondering if you could give us a little history lesson, and no better time than right before our July 4th Independence Day holiday here. You've written that it's always been the nature of U.S. war in its imperial form to start out with false accusations supported by a hyperactive media to create domestic political support for war or continued war. You've written that this is true for U.S. wars in Vietnam, Central America, the Spanish-American War, the acquisition of Hawaii, the Mexican-American War. The U.S. supported the British Opium Wars, and for hundreds of years, wars of genocide against indigenous Native American Indians. How has false accusations propagated by the press fed into the American war machine?
It's if the last couple centuries that the United States government has instigated. These wars are typically just, as you were saying, John, it typically cheered on by an American public that has been led to believe that these wars are either defensive wars necessary to defend, American freedom, to property, lives, etc., or they are wars of revenge, that this is a way to achieve justice, that this will be redemptive violence through these wars. And what usually happens is these ideas about the war are supported and believed by a majority of the population until they are disproven, which usually occurs years afterwards, and usually after tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people have been killed and wounded. And that's the case for these wars as well, too, these current wars. Certainly, people are familiar with the lies that brought us the Iraq War. The Libyan War was a war based on lies. The British Parliament actually did an inquiry, and their inquiry, the results of that inquiry was that the Libyan War was based on lies. The various activities and actions in Syria have been, based on uncertain events, if not outright lies, and so on and so forth. And one of the things I'm recalling now too is you see this often. You see this with journalists who want to have the access, who want to break scoops, who want to maybe curry favor with the military intelligence establishment. But I'm thinking specifically of one book in particular. In 2007, Ron Suskind, who was a Wall Street Journal reporter, a Pulitzer Prize-winning Wall Street Journal reporter, wrote a book called The 1% Doctrine. Right. And this book was a New York Times bestseller, and it was about the United States intelligence agency's efforts after 9/11 to stop Al-Qaeda. And it had all kinds of stories in it, all kinds of details. In particular, there was this detail about, or this story about a cyanide canister that Al-Qaeda had developed that they were going to put into the New York subway system and, kill tens of thousands of people with cyanide. And this book is published. It's a best-selling book. It's an authoritative book, and it turns out that almost none of it is true. As we find out years later, none of that was true. These stories that Suskind had been told, they were basically lies. They were basically fantasies provided to him by anonymous intelligence officials to provide a narrative for the ongoing war on terror. So this is something that has occurred all throughout history and occurs now. And you can see, I always say to people, you have to look at this and ask, for stories like this, who benefits? Obviously, this Russia bounty story is a well-planned leak because each day the New York Times reports something new. Mm-hmm. So rather than it being where you might think there was an intelligence officer who was just upset that this story was not being, that Russia would have put bounties on Americans and nothing was being done about it, and in an emotional outburst, he or she leaks it. What we're seeing is that there's a controlled leak, a planned leak, where each day new information comes out. And so it's coordinated between the New York Times and these anonymous officials. Right. And then also, too, who benefits, of course, is, you look at the Pentagon, you look at the defense industries, the tens of billions of dollars that are being planned to spend on new weaponry. We're talking about bomber planes that are going to cost $2 billion apiece, aircraft carriers that are $15 billion apiece, new tanks that are tens of millions of dollars apiece. I mean, there's a lot of money wrapped up in having an adversary like Russia and continuing tensions, as well as, too, there are people who don't want to leave Afghanistan. And we've seen that because yesterday, Wednesday, the House of Representatives, the Armed Services Committee, voted 45-11 to put conditions on the removal of U.S. troops to Afghanistan that, from what I read, are conditions that basically can never be met. You know, the conditions are asking to certify that that things out of the control of the United States would not occur. So these conditions can never be met. So you're already seeing that the effects of this leak in terms of certain people benefiting or certain camps benefiting, as well as, too, this is a leak that's coming 5 months or so from the election. There is great political interest in this story. Of course, great media interest in this story. But the Russiagate effect is still here. I mean, the stories about Russia were what propelled MSNBC to its top rankings. And so there's a great media interest in these stories, as well then the political opportunism for Donald Trump's opponents, for the Democrats as well as those within the Republican Party who don't like him, to utilize this to castigate him as a traitor. And the reality is that, the three of us, everybody listening, all 7.5 billion people on this planet are caught in between, because this is a story that, regardless of its veracity, is increasing tensions between the United States and Russia, who between the two have 6,000 armed and active nuclear weapons.
Matt, we have a call for you. Caller, if you're listening, go ahead with your question.
Who between the two have 6,000 armed and active nuclear weapons.
Matt, we have a
caller. You on the air?
Caller, if you're listening, go ahead with your question.
Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciate, Matt, the historical perspective that you gave. And I'd like, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to go back to the U.S. support for the Mujahideen in the 90s and the supplying of weapons then and the tensions with Russia, and just wonder how that is also playing into a kind of feeling in intelligence that maybe we have to get back at the Russians again and get back at the Taliban. I fully agree with you about not wanting that peace in Afghanistan. So my first question is how that not so distant historical perspective in Afghanistan plays into the current leak, quote unquote leak. And then I'm wondering if you talk about what further damage this is going to do for Afghans who have been the ones who are really caught in the middle of all of this and whose lives are suffering from this every day. I really appreciate your perspective on this, Matt.
Well, thank you so much for bringing up the Afghans, because we often make this a story about us when it really is a story about the Afghans in terms of the war. Their suffering has been immense for as long as I've been alive, basically. So in 1973, the king is overthrown in Afghanistan, and that was the year I was born. And so I always think that if I was an Afghan man, my whole life would have been consumed with, at best, political chaos, and of course, at worst, these wars of the last 40-some-odd years. Millions of Afghans have died in this war. You really can't describe it as differing wars, because the actors may change, but the suffering is constant and among the same people. So Afghanistan is millions have died, millions have been maimed. They now may be, because many Syrians have returned home, they now may be the largest displaced population in the world in terms of refugees and internally displaced people. Millions of Afghans are homeless. Millions of Afghans live in camps and have lived in camps for generations now in Pakistan and Iran. And there are continuing issues with drought and drug addiction and other blights, basically, that make life even worse for the Afghans. So I'm really appreciative that you brought this up, because if the success of this, and a lot of people are looking at this, if it's true that the Russians are doing this to chase the United States out of Afghanistan, my take would be that they want to spoil. If I was the Russians, I would want to spoil the U.S. efforts to leave Afghanistan, because what's best for Russia, what's best for China, what's best for whoever is an adversary of the United States, however you want to describe that, and I don't happen to believe that should be the case, but that's the way it is, unfortunately. The best thing for these countries is for the U.S. and the United States to be stuck in these wars where trillions of American dollars are being wasted, thousands of lives are being wasted, American decision making is paralyzed, the view of America worldwide is just completely drenched in the blood of these wars. And I have a friend of mine who came back from China. I remember in 2010, he had just met with some Chinese, and I know we're talking about Russia, but the story holds. And he had just met with some Chinese diplomats there, and he'd asked them, like, what basically, and this is all off the record, but what does the Chinese Foreign Ministry want to do in terms of engagement with the United States? And his counterpart said, we would love to see the United States continue to be stuck in these unending wars, because it paralyzes the United States and it makes the United States waste resources, all kinds of resources, as well as just ruining the global image of the United States. But getting back to Afghanistan, the interesting thing about when the Soviet Union went to Afghanistan, this was a deliberate attempt by the United States to bait the United States into, to bait the Soviet Union into invading Afghanistan. If you look in the memoirs of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, or Bill Gates, who went on to become the director of Central Intelligence as well as the Secretary of Defense, both of these men make it clear that the United States started funding the Mujahideen in the year prior to the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, in order to try and trap the Soviet Union into, get the Soviets to invade and to get them trapped in Afghanistan as payback for Vietnam. So this idea that these bounties may be a payback for what the United States did to the Soviets in Afghanistan goes back to this idea that we're going to bait the Soviets into Afghanistan and give them their own Vietnam. And so you get this understanding then on this macro level of war as just basically a revenge construct, that it never ends, and that the ideas that you go into it with are always shattered, and that the easiest way to sum it is, war is a breeding ground for unintended consequences, and certainly you see this. The other aspect too, when we talk about these bounties and the shock and the being aghast by the United States and by people in the media or by the public about how could this happen? How dare they put bounties on our soldiers? It shows how shielded, how much of a bubble the American public, American media, American politicians have been in with these wars, how these wars really haven't affected us. Because this idea that somehow we could be touched by these wars sets off just really hysteria, when the reality is of course people are going to fight back. Of course these kinds of things are going to happen when you engage in war.
Matt, I've got a question about the nature of intelligence agencies themselves. You were a battlefield commander, company commander as a Marine, and then later a Foreign Service officer for the State Department in the reconstruction of Afghanistan, and you know how to evaluate intel, even if it's sketchy intel, because lives depend upon it. Here you have our intelligence agencies, and I'm wondering. Here in the United States, we're talking about dismantling police departments and rebuilding them. I'm wondering whether we have to dismantle our intelligence agencies and rebuild them. We have a recent history about the CIA lying about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, about Libya's impending genocide, about Syria's quote-unquote moderate rebel terrorists, and especially the late Russiagate hoax. In my personal life, I was hired by Buzzy Krongard in 1979, right out of college. After 9/11, it turns out that Buzzy was the number three guy at the CIA, and he was buying puts in the airline stocks right before 9/11. and made millions of dollars. What, I mean, could it be any more wrong than it is?
You know, and the lying is pervasive. It's part of what they do. I mean, it's part of not just the culture, it's part of the job is to lie, or a major aspect of the job is to lie. And I mean, they lied about Guantanamo Bay. They lied about torture. They lied about the drone program. They lied about the surveillance, all of our phone calls, all of our emails, everything being recorded and logged and kept. They lied about all this. And then you have seen where major, former leaders of the NSA and the CIA are now political pundits. John Brennan, Michael Hayden, James Clapper. These are men who are now making their living, basically, besides, of course, shilling for the intelligence, the privatized intelligence agencies, the private intelligence agencies. They make their living as political pundits now. So you certainly have a case, just as you said, for a complete review of the intelligence agencies, because they have failed spectacularly, but they've also lied.
Sorry, we had a little technical issue. Could you repeat that again, Matt?
I agree, John, that the idea of dismantling and rebuilding the intelligence agencies is necessary. There are clearly spectacular failures from the intelligence agencies, and list of lies as long as both of my arms. And a politicization of the intelligence agencies and work overtly. They've always been used for political purposes, but I don't think we've ever seen such an overt use of the intelligence agencies in domestic politics as we have seen in the last several years. So absolutely, there is this very strong case and rationale. I mean, this should have happened in several years ago. The CIA broke into the computers of the Senate. That was people should have gone to jail for that. The CIA should have been defunded. I mean, all kinds of things should have happened, and nothing happened. The Senate rolled over on it. I mean, that should have precipitated a constitutional crisis for that type of invasion of the executive branch into the legislative branch. Right. But nothing happened. So I doubt we'll see any type of reform or any change. They're afraid. I think a lot of politicians are afraid of the intelligence agency, afraid of what they can do, of what they can leak, what they could put out there, as well as, too, politicians at the end of the day don't want to seem un-American. And unfortunately, because of a host of reasons, supporting the CIA, supporting the NSA, supporting the FBI is very American, even though none of those organizations deserve our support, let alone respect.
Matt, unfortunately, we have to say goodbye. Matt Ho, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Policy. I want to thank you for your past service to our country, but just as importantly, and maybe even more importantly, I want to thank you for your continued service to our country. Thank you, Matt.
Well, thank you both. Thank you both for having me on. You guys stay safe and healthy, and keep doing what you're doing. You guys do really great work. Thank you.
Same to you. We've been speaking with Matt Ho. We're going to take a brief pause and then be back with our next guest.